What's up, everyone? Hope everybody's having a great day. Today, we need to talk about the most heartbreaking measurement in aviation, 1,800 feet. That's how short the Biffle family aircraft came from making runway 28 at Statesville, 1,800 feet. About a third of a mile, a 30-second walk, a distance you could throw a football if you had a good arm. They were that close to safety, that close to survival, that close to this being a story about a scary emergency landing instead of a tragedy that killed 7 people. And folks, when you understand what those 1,800 feet represent, when you realize everything they did right still wasn't enough to cover that final gap, it'll break your heart all over again. Because this wasn't a crew that gave up. This wasn't an aircraft that was out of control. This was a properly configured airplane with its landing lights on, gear down, flaps extended, doing everything right except making the runway. The NTSB debris field analysis tells us exactly where the citation first hit the trees. The coordinates are precise. 35 degrees, 38 minutes, 47 seconds north. 80 degrees, 57 minutes, 18 seconds west. If you pull that up on Google Earth, you can see it. A scar through the forest that starts 1,800 feet short of the runway threshold. Not 1,800 feet from the end of the runway, 1,800 feet from where the runway begins, from where the pavement starts, from where safety was waiting. The debris pattern shows they were lined up perfectly. They weren't off to the side. They weren't trying to land in a field. They were on the extended center line of runway 28, flying a normal approach path just too low. Let me put 1,800 feet in perspective for you. A Citation 2 at approach speed covers that distance in about 12 seconds. 12 seconds. If they'd had 12 more seconds of flight, they would have made it. If the engines had produced just a little more thrust, if the weather had been just slightly better, if they'd configured just a few seconds later, if any of a dozen factors had been slightly different, those 1,800 feet would have been covered, and 7 people would still be alive. That's the cruelty of aviation. The margins are measured in seconds and feet, and when you run out of either, physics doesn't give you credit for almost making it. The landing light configuration tells us something important. The NTSB found the landing lights were on and extended. That's not something you do if you've given up. That's not something you do if you're just trying to crash somewhere survivable. Landing lights are what you turn on when you expect to land, when you believe you're going to make the runway, when you're flying a normal approach. Dennis Dutton, with all his experience, thought they were going to make it. He configured the aircraft properly. Gear down, flaps extended, landing lights on. Everything exactly as it should be for landing. Except they were 1,800 feet too low. The debris pattern shows the aircraft was in a normal landing attitude when it hit the trees. Nose slightly up, wings level, not diving, not spinning, not out of control. Just descending on what would have been a perfect approach path if the runway had been 1,800 feet longer. Or if they'd been 1,800 feet higher. The first impact was with trees about 60 feet tall. The left wing hit first, causing the aircraft to cartwheel, but until that moment they were flying. They were under control. They were doing everything right. They just ran out of sky 1,800 feet too soon. Think about what those final seconds must have been like in the cockpit. They can see the runway. It's right there. The threshold markings visible through the drizzle, the runway lights, if they were on, beckoning them home. Safety just seconds away. But the trees are getting bigger. The radio altimeter is counting down. 50 feet, 40, 30. The ground proximity warning is probably screaming, "Terrain, terrain, pull up, pull up." But there's nowhere to pull up to. No power left to climb. No energy left to trade. Just the horrible realization that they're not going to make it. That 1,800 feet might as well be 1,800 miles. The configuration they found the aircraft in tells the story of a crew that never gave up. Gear down and locked. That's what you want for landing. Full flaps. Maximum lift and drag for the slowest possible touchdown speed. Landing lights on to help judge height and see the runway. Fuel pumps on. Everything configured exactly as the checklist demands. They weren't cutting corners. They weren't rushing procedures. They were flying by the book. right until the trees interrupted their approach. The only thing wrong was altitude. They needed 1,800 feet they didn't have. Let's talk about what 1,800 feet means in terms of energy management. At approach speed, a Citation II descends at about 500 to 700 feet per minute in a normal approach. To cover 1,800 feet horizontally, while descending, let's say, 300 feet vertically, they would need about 12 seconds. But they didn't have 12 seconds. They didn't have the altitude to trade. They were already at treetop level with the runway still over a quarter-mile away. The math was impossible. Physics had already determined the outcome. Those 1,800 feet were uncrossable with the energy they had left. The weather at the time created what pilots call an illusion of attainability. They could see the runway. It wasn't obscured by fog or rain. It was right there, visible, reachable. Almost. In complete instrument conditions, they might have executed a missed approach earlier, but when you can see your goal, when safety is visible, when you're so close you can almost touch it, the human instinct is to press on, to try just a little harder, to believe you can stretch the glide just enough. Dennis probably thought he could make it right up until the moment he couldn't. The passengers in the back probably had no idea they were 1,800 feet short. From their seats, they couldn't see directly forward. They couldn't judge the approach angle. They trusted the pilots. They felt the gear come down, normal. They felt the flaps extend, normal. They saw the landing lights illuminate, normal. Everything felt like a typical landing until suddenly it wasn't. Until trees started hitting the wings, until the aircraft started breaking apart. They went from expecting to land to dying in less than a second. No time to comprehend they were short. No time to realize 1,800 feet was the difference between life and death. The fire that erupted after impact consumed much of the evidence, but the NTSB was able to determine the engines were producing power at impact. Not maximum power, but power. They weren't shut down. They weren't failed. They were running, just not producing enough thrust to overcome the drag of a fully configured Citation at maximum weight. The gear and flaps that were necessary for landing were also anchors dragging them down. Every second of flight with that configuration burned energy they couldn't spare. But what choice did they have? You can't land without gear. You need flaps for a slow touchdown. They were caught in aviation's cruelest catch-22. The debris field extends for about 400 feet from first impact to main wreckage site. That tells us the aircraft had significant forward speed at impact. They weren't falling out of the sky. They weren't stalled. They were flying just too low. Each tree they hit robbed them of energy, slowed them down, damaged the aircraft more. By the time they came to rest, they'd been through a meat grinder of trees and terrain. The aircraft destroyed, not by a single catastrophic impact, but by a series of increasingly violent collisions as the trees tore it apart, piece by piece. The runway at Statesville is 5,500 feet long, more than enough for a Citation II, which needs about 3,000 feet to land and stop. If they'd made the threshold, they would have had plenty of pavement. They could have landed long. They could have been fast. They could have been unstable. The runway would have forgiven all of that. But runways don't extend backward. They start where they start. And 1,800 feet before that point is just trees and earth and death. All that beautiful, useful pavement just out of reach, like dying of thirst within sight of water. What makes this even more tragic is that with modern technology, they might have made it. A Citation with synthetic vision would have shown them exactly how short they were. Enhanced flight vision systems could have given them better situational awareness. Auto-throttles could have managed power more efficiently. FADEC could have optimized engine performance. Modern avionics might have given them the edge to cover those 1,800 feet. But they were flying 40-year-old technology that didn't have those advantages. They were 1,800 feet and 40 years short of safety. The investigators found no evidence of heroic last-second maneuvering, no indication they tried to dump flaps to reduce drag. No sign they firewalled the throttles in desperation. The aircraft hit the trees in a normal approach configuration, suggesting they either didn't know they were short until too late or accepted their fate professionally. Dennis Dutton flew that citation right to the end, exactly as he'd been trained. By the book, by the numbers. The only number that was wrong was altitude. 1,800 feet wrong. I keep thinking about the other aircraft that landed successfully that day. That Aztec that took off right behind them landed without incident. The weather was the same, the runway was the same, the only difference was the aircraft and the emergency. The Aztec wasn't dealing with engine problems, wasn't at maximum weight, wasn't flying with degraded performance. The Aztec made the runway because it had the energy to make it. The Citation didn't, because it had burned that energy dealing with whatever emergency caused them to return. 1,800 feet was the measure of that energy deficit. The air traffic recordings from that day would be interesting if they existed, but Statesville is an uncontrolled field. No tower, no approach control, just pilots policing themselves. If there had been a tower, they might have called out, "Traffic alert, you appear low." If there had been approach radar, they might have gotten vectors to a longer final. If there had been an ILS, they might have had vertical guidance showing them they were below glide path. But uncontrolled fields don't have those advantages. You're on your own. And when you're 1,800 feet short, on your own becomes fatally alone. The configuration of the aircraft suggests they committed to landing early, probably a beam the numbers on downwind, if they flew a pattern, or maybe even earlier if they were coming straight in. Once you put the gear down in a citation, you're committed. The drag is so significant that going around becomes difficult or impossible. Add full flaps, and you're definitely landing somewhere. The only question is whether you make the runway or hit whatever's in front of it. They committed to runway 28 and came up 1,800 feet short. That commitment probably sealed their fate. There's been speculation about whether they could have made runway 10 instead. It was closer to their position when they started their return. The wind would have been a tailwind, but only a few knots. The approach would have been more direct. But we'll never know if that would have given them the 1,800 feet they needed. They chose 28 for reasons we can only guess. Maybe better wind, maybe better visual references, maybe just pilot preference. But that choice meant they needed 1,800 more feet than they had. The passenger's trust is what gets me. Greg Biffle trusted his friend Dennis to fly them safely. Christina trusted her husband's judgment about the flight. Emma and Ryder trusted their parents completely. Craig Wadsworth trusted the entire operation. None of them knew they were 1,800 feet short until it was too late. They sat in that cabin believing in the competence of the pilots and the capability of the aircraft. Their trust was justified. The pilots were competent. The aircraft was capable. But 1,800 feet doesn't care about trust. Physics doesn't respect reputation. Gravity doesn't make exceptions. What would 1,800 feet of altitude have meant? At their approach speed, it would have given them another 15 to 20 seconds of flight, enough to clear the trees, enough to reach the threshold, enough to turn a tragedy into a close call. We measure altitude in hundreds and thousands of feet, but really, we're measuring time. Time to think, time to react, time to recover. They ran out of time 1,800 feet short of the runway. Their altitude account went to 0 while they still had distance to cover. That's the brutal math of aviation energy management. The fire that consumes the aircraft after impact destroyed most of the physical evidence, but the impact sequence is clear from the debris pattern. First contact with trees, left wing separation, fuselage rotation, right wing impact, tail separation, main fuselage impact with terrain, post-crash fire. All of this happening in maybe 2 seconds. From controlled flight to total destruction in the time it takes to blink twice. 1,800 feet from safety to catastrophe in an instant. The transition so violent that nobody could have survived, regardless of seats or safety equipment. The runway they were trying to reach has seen thousands of safe landings. Citations land there regularly. It's not a particularly challenging airport. The approach to runway 28 is straightforward. No obstacles except the trees that claim them. No unusual procedures, just a normal visual approach that comes up 1,800 feet short if you don't have the energy to make it. The airport that should have been their salvation became the scene of their destruction. Not because of any deficiency in the airport, but because 1,800 feet of trees stood between them and the pavement. Modern airports have safety areas beyond the runways, clear zones where aircraft that land short have a chance of survival.
But general aviation airports like Statesville often have trees or terrain right up to the threshold. There's no forgiveness for being short. You either make the pavement or you hit whatever's there. 1,800 feet short at Chicago O'Hare might be survivable. 1,800 feet short at Statesville is catastrophic. The same distance, but completely different outcomes based on what's under that approach path. The investigation will eventually tell us why they were 1,800 feet short. Was it engine failure that robbed them of thrust? Was it wind shear that pushed them down? Was it simple energy mismanagement? Was it configuration, timing? Whatever the cause, the effect was measured in feet, not miles, not hundreds of yards, just 1,800 feet. In aviation terms, that's nothing. In human terms, it's everything. It's the difference between reunion and funeral, between relief and grief, between close call and catastrophe. The landing lights being on haunts me. It's such a normal thing, such a routine part of landing. Dennis or Jack, whoever was handling the checklist, turned those lights on because they expected to use them, expected to see the runway surface in those lights, expected to judge their flare height by what those lights illuminated. Instead, those lights illuminated trees. Instead of runway centerline, they lit up forest. The last thing those landing lights showed was the impossible gap between where they were and where they needed to be. 1,800 feet of impossibility. If you visit Statesville Airport today, you can stand at the threshold of runway 28 and look back along the approach path. 1,800 feet out, you'll see the trees that stop them. They're not particularly tall, not particularly dense, just trees doing what trees do, standing where they've always stood, being obstacles to aircraft that can't clear them. From the runway threshold, those trees don't look that far away. You could walk to them in 5 minutes. But for a citation running out of energy, those trees might as well have been a mountain. They were an obstacle that couldn't be cleared with the altitude available. The families waiting for news that day probably initially heard the aircraft was close to the runway, maybe even heard it almost made it. That false hope making the final reality even worse. So close. If only. What if? 1,800 feet of what if. But aviation doesn't deal in what if. It deals in what is. And what is that 1,800 feet was too far. The energy wasn't there. The altitude wasn't available. The thrust wasn't sufficient. All the skill and experience in that cockpit couldn't create the 1,800 feet they needed. Recovery operations found personal items scattered throughout those 1,800 feet. Pieces of luggage, Christmas presents that would never be opened, Ryder's toys, Emma's phone, Greg's racing memorabilia, Christina's jewelry. The detritus of 7 lives spread across 1/3 of a mile of forest, each item marking the path from where they were to where they almost made it. 1,800 feet of destroyed dreams and ended futures. The investigators cataloging each piece, trying to reconstruct those final seconds from the scattered remains. So when we talk about the Biffle crash, we need to remember those 1,800 feet. Not as a failure of the crew who did everything they could. Not as a deficiency of the aircraft which performed as designed, but as the cruel precision of physics. The unforgiving nature of energy management. The binary outcome of aviation where close doesn't count. They were 1,800 feet from safety, 12 seconds from survival, 1/3 of a mile from making it. But in aviation, 1,800 feet short is the same as 1,800 miles short. You either make the runway or you don't. They didn't by 1,800 feet. The approach lighting system at a major airport extends about 3,000 feet from the threshold. If Statesville had such a system, the citation would have been among the lights when it crashed. The strobe lights that guide aircraft to safety would have been flashing uselessly as the aircraft descended below them into the trees. But Statesville doesn't have approach lights, just the runway itself, starting where it starts, ending where it ends. No extension, no forgiveness. No extra margin for aircraft that come up short. Just trees at minus 1,800 feet and pavement at 0. The certification standards for runways include calculations for obstacle clearance. Approach surfaces are supposed to be clear of obstacles for certain distances and angles, but those standards assume aircraft are following normal approach paths at normal approach angles with normal performance. They don't account for emergency aircraft with degraded performance trying to stretch every foot of glide. They don't factor in aircraft that are configured early burning energy they need. They don't consider that 1,800 feet short might be the best a struggling crew can manage. That 1,800 feet represents everything about this tragedy. The narrow margins, the missing energy, the impossible physics.
The proximity to safety that remained just out of reach. 7 people dying within sight of survival, within seconds of landing, within 1,800 feet of making it. It's a measurement that will haunt everyone connected to this crash. The investigators who measured it, the families who know their loved ones almost made it, the pilots who fly into Statesville and count backward from the threshold. 1,800 feet, about 6 football fields. The distance between death and a scary story with a happy ending. Thank you all for watching. This discussion of those 1,800 feet has been difficult but necessary. We need to understand that aviation margins are measured in small units that have enormous consequences. 1,800 feet, 12 seconds, 300 feet of altitude. These aren't big numbers, but they're the difference between making the news and making the runway, between becoming a statistic and becoming a story of survival. The Biffle family was 1,800 feet from safety, so close that it's heartbreaking, so far that it was fatal. That's the reality of aviation, the cruel precision of physics, the unforgiving nature of energy and altitude. They almost made it. But in aviation, almost doesn't count. Only making the runway counts. And they were 1,800 feet short. Forever 1,800 feet short. We'll see you at the checkered flag.